Forgiveness of debt is merely a gift from one undeserving soul to another. In other words, mercy. Before I begin, I want to tell you how much I admire the vicar. Putting together a sermon takes research and hard work, and many in this room have had to deal with me over the past few weeks getting this sermon ready. Peter, a disciple, one of the inner circle of Christ's followers, is asking Jesus what to do when a brother or sister sins against him. It is sometimes called the parable of the unmerciful servant. Many of you know me by name, but you do not know my profession. I am a bankruptcy judge for the Southern District of New York, one of the busiest commercial courts in the world. What many of you may not know or do not know, it is also the court for individuals in financial stress. Every day, individuals from all walks of life, from all different incomes and family backgrounds, file for bankruptcy. Matthew, as a former tax collector, used the language of finance as a metaphor. I'm not sure about a former tax collector, but as a bankruptcy judge, I do not see anyone who has a debt as someone who has sinned. And even though the words seem to be interchangeable in the Old and the New Testament, they are not crooks. Crooks really do get a different treatment, but that's not today's message. Most debtors have simply fallen on hard times and have, at times, made bad decisions. That doesn't make them bad, or sinful, or immoral, or unethical. They have simply had to come to terms with a world lacking in mercy and forgiveness of the kind Jesus is teaching Peter and is being reported by Matthew. For a moment, I want you to imagine with me. Just take a moment. You're a young spouse and a parent. You live in this incredibly lush farm area. Your profession is that of a farmer. You grow grain to make bread, to make the best, most delicious bread. It's sold in Grand Central Station. You're proud of your family and of your crops. You are God-fearing. As a matter of fact, the only day you rest is the Sabbath. That is the day you pause, worship, and pray. Even on the Sabbath, you notice a weed in your field that is taller than your grain. Though dressed in your best, you stop the family, you walk out into the field and pull those tall weeds. Teaching your children that pulling the weed now not only makes the field more attractive, but makes it better for harvesting. When cutting the grain, the seed from the weed will not be mixed with the good seed, and thus producing a cleaner, higher grade of grain to sell. You live on fertile land. You farm this land much as your ancestors farmed this very land. Better tools, but still you farm it pretty much the same way. You don't consider yourself poor. You have a healthy family, and you have the soil. Early in the spring, you realize you've not saved enough seed from the previous year's crop to plant. You dress in your best everyday outfit. You're clean and you're neat for the trip into town to buy the grain. But first, you have to go to the banker, the moneylender, and borrow the money to purchase the grain. You have a good reputation as a frugal, hardworking, honest farmer. Of course you're lent the money, knowing that there is a cost to borrowing money. You promise to pay with the proceeds of the harvest. If you cannot pay, you promise to give the lender title to your land and all your goods. You are a farmer. You're at once optimistic and pessimistic. You know your crop will be plentiful because you take such good care of your fields, and God will bless you and your precious family. Your family will have good things. Your children will go to school, and you will all have new clothing. Pessimistic in that, as a farmer, you must depend on nature, on the sun and the rain, and in just the right amounts. You have tilled the soil, planted the seed, chopped the weeds, nurtured your crops. But the rain doesn't come, and the rain doesn't come, and the rain doesn't come. You watch as your crops dry up and wilt, then shrivel. There is no harvest. Your pride is diminished. Pride is diminished. You go to the moneylender and you explain your plight. Not a problem. The moneylender explains, for you are a good, honest, God-fearing farmer. As promised, when the money was lent, you give up title to the land and all your goods. You will continue to live on the land and pay rent. Next year, you can pay your debt, and you'll pay the principal plus the interest, and you'll get the farm and all the goods back. You will take care of your family until the next harvest. You need new money to pay the rent, to buy new seed, and cover the cost of planting and harvesting. The money lender gives you what you need. Optimistic, you have no choice but to begin again. You till the soil and borrow the money for the seed, and you take pride in your farming. You pull the weeds. You know it's going to be a good crop. And this year, there wasn't a drought. Actually, you had a nice gentle rain and abundant sun. The crop was beautiful. It was time for harvest. Then a dark cloud came from the northeast. Thunder shook the earth, lightning danced in the sky, and the hail came down and pounded your crop and took everything. You no longer own the land. You have nothing to sell, to pay the rent, or replenish the seed. All is owed to the moneylender. Matthew was steeped in the ethics of the Old Testament as seen through the teachings of Jesus. To understand the financial metaphors used by Matthew, we need to look at what the Old Testament teaches us. Nehemiah of the Old Testament heard of the plight of the farmer, such as the one we just imagined, and can see why Nehemiah was angry. And Nehemiah said, "And lo, we bring into bondage our sons and our daughters to be servants. Some of our daughters are brought into bondage already. Neither is it in our power to redeem them, for other men have taken our lands and our vineyards." We are led to believe that during biblical times the first exchanges were barter, but barter would seemingly only work if it was an exchange among equals. Nehemiah's farmer, as the farmer we imagined, had nothing to barter with. He had mortgaged all he had. The Bible is peppered with language of debt, sin, forgiveness, reckoning, redemption. All of these words actually also are probably derived from the language of ancient finance. Biblical text teaches us that debts need to be repaid, but that's not all the text says. The original translation of the Lord's Prayer, and this was in 1381, reads, "Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we would also forgive our debtors." It was retranslated in 1559 to trespass and trespassers. While it is considered a good deed to repay one's debt, the Bible recognizes that it is not always possible and provides a mechanism for discharging debts. Deuteronomy 15:1 and 2. At the end of every 7 years, thou shalt make a release, and this is the manner of the release. Every creditor that lendeth aught unto his neighbor shall release it. He shall not exact it of his neighbor or his brother, because it is called the Lord's release. The words, "he shall not exact it of his neighbor," are to warn creditors that they may no longer demand payment for the debt as it has been legally canceled. The Bible specifically forbids the creditor from taking action to exact, meaning to collect the debt after that 7th year, the sabbatical year. It is a complete forgiveness of debt. In biblical times, if a debtor could not pay their debt, debtors could not pay their debt, they might have to become indentured servants, and their wages would be applied to the debt owed. Once their time period for service was complete and the debt was paid, the creditor was expected to give the debtor enough compensation to allow them to earn a living and enough food to feed and clothe their families. In other words, grant them mercy to rebuild their life. The biblical understanding, the practical consequences of leaving the debtor with no means to earn a living, set forth laws requiring that certain assets be exempt from execution and attachment. In Exodus, it talks about the garment, his covering. If he needs his coat or his blankets, these items must be returned night after night. The Bible has another restriction on collateral, and it's found in Deuteronomy. And that one is allow the creditors to, the Bible does not allow the creditor to take the collateral for a security loan if it is something to sustain livelihood. So they needed a functioning meal. You could not take the upper or the lower stone. If a creditor, you have to have both to grind the grain to make the bread. If the creditor knows that the debtor does not have the money, the debtor should not be shamed. He should be granted mercy and forgiveness. Yet many are reluctant to consider the human consequences and rather think that the people that owe money are inferior. The language of debt and the language of religion are the same. Sin is missing the mark. Not paying a debt is also missing the mark. Which brings us back to today's gospel. Remember, Matthew would have been knowledgeable in the law. He was a tax collector. He would have known Roman law. And being Jewish, he more than likely had a deep knowledge of the Torah. It was claimed that he was at the time preaching in Jewish communities. Thus, when he was telling the story of the unmerciful servant, he would probably have been keeping in mind, and when recounting the story, the teachings that he had been brought up with, that he understood. In this verse, the king first ordered his servant and the servant's wife and children sold because of a debt worth 10 talents. 60 years of wages. That was an unbelievable sum of money. The servant, the debtor, fell down and begged for mercy, and the king gave him mercy. Since he was the king, in other words, he was the government, it might have been called a government bailout. This servant debtor was forgiven of a debt that exceeds the imagination of the ordinary person Matthew was teaching. This forgiven servant had a servant that owed him 10 denarii, 1 day's wage. 1 day's wage in comparison to 60 years of wages. The servant's servant also begged and pleaded for mercy and forgiveness. There was no bailout for him. Because of arrogance and greed, he would not forgive or grant mercy to this his humble servant. The message of this parable and of the Old Testament is that people are not diminished because they have debts that they cannot pay. Rather, the lesson is that the holder of the debt are diminished when they fail to offer mercy and forgiveness. How does that affect my worldview? I think we go back to Romans, that the teaching today. We do not live to ourselves and we do not die to ourselves. We basically live because of, in honor of the Lord, and give thanks. We have a struggle with this, and in the bankruptcy world, there is a study from a group from Princeton and Harvard that say when someone files bankruptcy, remember our farmer, they are at that moment in the same stress as if they've lost a child. So forgiveness and mercy is life-giving. To be non-judgmental and gracious is life-giving. So we need to look through the Old Testament and the New Testament teachings to the struggle that we as humans have in helping make difficult decisions to grant mercy and forgiveness.